Alright, let's take a look at planning permission and building control. It's episode 5. So, let's get started. I don't want to make this episode. Yeah, well, I think you should. There's quite a long paper trail required to do this project. You need pre-planning advice, planning permission, building control pre-approval, 2 kinds of party wall agreement, and a build-over agreement for the drains before you can do anything. It's boring. No one's going to want to know about this stuff. Well, I'm not sure that's true, and in any case, it's going to be a lot easier explaining stuff later on if you do this bit now. But a lot of that paper trail would be the same regardless of what materials you were using to build the extension. So for our purposes here, I'm mainly just interested in what difference it makes to be building in Hempcrete. If you just sit here in lockdown for months talking to yourself, you're going to go mad. Well, how else am I going to make the video flow? It's not an editing style, it's a split personality disorder. I think you're being very negative. Negative or realistic? I mean, how long do you think you can keep this up anyway? As long as it takes, I guess. Just because you put on a hat and glasses doesn't mean anyone's convinced that you're somebody else. I know that. I'm not stupid. I mean, if I'm stupid, you're stupid, right? Because we're the same person. Are you calling me stupid? No, you're calling you stupid. Obviously. I think you should try and be a bit nicer to us. I don't see why. This is nonsense and somebody should call it out for what it is. Nonsense. There's a lockdown on. There's nobody here. Would you really be happier if we were doing nothing? I guess not. Alright then, stop making this harder and let's get on with it. Okay. Do you want to cuddle? Yes. Alright, well, switch off the camera then. We haven't got that kind of budget. Okay. Pre-planning advice. Pre-planning advice is really just a way of saying, if we asked you for this, are we wasting our time? So in this case, if we draw something right up against the boundary, is that a waste of time? Are you going to say no? In this case, no. That's fine. And beyond that, they really just want to see that the building makes sense in the setting, that the design hangs together across the whole of the building, that it'll look okay, that it's in keeping with surrounding buildings and that sort of thing. They're not worried about what it's made of. It could be made of jam and string, as far as they're concerned, as long as the design is good. They know that building control are coming along behind them to check that the jam and the string are up to regulation standard, so all they're really worried about is the form, and they're really very helpful. I've heard a lot of people moaning about planning permission and building control, but I can only guess that they went in there assuming they were the enemy and had a bad experience. Whenever I've asked them questions, they've been very helpful and fairly open-minded to me using a weird material. Planning permission. For the planning application, you need to produce plans and elevations of the existing structure and the one that's being proposed. I had some help getting all of this stuff together. The design work is all done in SketchUp, but a friend did put the plans and elevations into an architectural design package to make them look a little bit more professional. And then there's a thing called a design and access statement, which seems to just be a way of showing them that you give a damn and that you might spend a bit more on your project maybe. At the end of the day, planning departments are interested in whether you're improving the housing stock. So you don't have to submit it, but it can help. The design access statement is full of pretty aspirational pictures of elegantly crafted architectural spaces that also have these huge, terrifying pigeons and strange, ghostly figures carrying shopping. It gives context about the location and the existing structures, and also design elements from the local area, warehouses, shop fronts, and double mews doors. This bit's a bit like the sketchbook you keep in art school to show your progress. Look, we drew this roof, but it was crap, so we did another one. There's also some information about the materials. There's the Hempcrete, and of course, the all-important access parking and bins. Is he still talking? Shh! There were problems at the planning stage. We had an objection, for instance, but we resolved that by lowering the roof a little, which is a rationale for building some leeway into the design. But none of the problems have anything to do with the building being made of hempcrete. You'll remember that the design in any case looks indistinguishable from a building made of brick and glass. So as far as planning are concerned, all you're dealing with are the same problems that you'd be dealing with if it were made of bricks. Once planning permission has been granted and you move on to building control, however, there's a little bit more to think about. Building control. If you're doing something unusual, some people advise that you hire your own building controller who knows the ins and outs to make the process more straightforward, but this is a very small structure, so it didn't seem worth going down that route. And that leaves the two normal options, which are to tell building control that you're starting and then proceed by calling them every time they want to inspect, or by submitting building control plans so that you can have the whole thing pre-approved. Now that costs a bit of money, but the advice I received was to do that anyway because it's an unusual structure, so that there aren't any surprises along the way. You can see from these folders it took me 7 attempts to get that right. Submitting building control plans is a big job in its own right. You have to put together much more detailed plans and sections showing the exact construction method, and go through multiple amendments until you get it right. The way SketchUp handles groups means that taking sections is a pain in the ass, so I just ended up drawing them again in a single plane in SketchUp. Here's the roof build-up, the footing detail, and the party wall. Party! There's also a detailed written description of how every part of the building conforms to building regulations, which went through multiple iterations because I've never done it before. And they also asked me to write a description of what hempcrete is and how it works. At this stage in the process, there were some eyebrows raised about some aspects of the design because in some ways it's quite different from what building control are used to, and on some of those things I was able to resolve it by explaining it, and sometimes I went along with what they're used to for an easy life. Let me start by talking about the foundation. A timber and hempcrete wall doesn't really weigh very much in comparison to a brick and cement one, so theoretically there should be an opportunity to use a smaller foundation and reduce the carbon emissions of the build, but frustratingly that wasn't really possible. At several points in the process, I might have been able to force the point by paying a structural engineer to demonstrate what was really necessary. And if it was a bigger building, that would definitely be worthwhile because there's quite a lot of extra carbon emitted by doing things the normal way. But in this case, it's a tiny little structure and I was trying to keep the costs down, so that wasn't really possible. You can build a hempcrete structure on a reinforced concrete raft foundation that spreads the load across the surface of the ground, or use a shallower strip foundation, or there are lots of other methods which have a lower carbon footprint than pouring a lot of concrete. But this is built on London clay, which is tricksy and has a habit of moving around, and in any case, building control know what a strip foundation is, and that's what they want to go with, just as if it were the equivalent brick wall. So it's on a strip foundation, but then comes the problem of the drains. This is a public sewer running through the yard. Now the extension misses the sewer by just enough, but the regulations laid down by the Thames Water Authority say that you've got to better the depth of this sewer by 150 mil. This is so that you don't put load on the sewer if you have a heavy building. As long as you go along with these regulations, you can just check a box on the Thames Water Authority website and you've got a build-over agreement. There's no mention of what you should do if you don't have a heavy building. It's probably not structurally necessary to make the foundation deeper than the sewer, but it would be difficult to show that. Consequently, a foundation a metre deep becomes a foundation nearly 2 metres deep. So now I'm forced to pour a huge amount of concrete to support a wall which doesn't really weigh very much. Back at the beginning I asked if it was possible to build a carbon negative extension. I think with a ridiculous poured concrete foundation like that, the answer is probably no, sadly. But everything above ground will be reduced carbon, so overall there'll still be carbon savings on the structure. This detail shows the hempcrete wall in green and the plinth that supports it. And this is another area where building control took a little bit of convincing. And the main difference from what they're used to is that they're not used to the wall build-up being breathable, and they're expecting a cavity wall structure to keep the plinth dry. Hempcrete is vapor permeable, but it will rot in the presence of standing water, so the plinth needs to be designed very carefully to make sure that the foot of the hempcrete wall is protected from any groundwater. Because the timber frame in this design is in the centre of the hempcrete wall, the load of the wall is also on the centre of the plinth, and this is where the cavity would usually be. That keeps the footing dry. So to deal with that, the waterproofing has been achieved using a membrane here, and then we put in these thermalite blocks which take the load of the timber frame and also provide a little bit of insulation to keep the footing warm. Building control also expected a step in the damp-proof course here to protect the base of this timber, but I was able to argue that any moisture entering the wall here can evaporate out again because this entire wall build-up is breathable. The Hempcrete experts actually suggest that this damp-proof course isn't necessary at all because any moisture making it up that far can escape through the breathable Hempcrete, but they say they've given up arguing with building control about that. The final issue was that this timber frame needs to be bolted or strapped to the structure below so that the building is tied into the ground, and the fixings break this damp-proof course. So if you believe the damp-proof course needs to be there, you either need to put stainless steel straps down this side and mend the point where they break the DPC using sealant, or you can drill through the base plate of the timber frame into the thermalite, put a resin anchor in there, and then the resin actually reseals the damp-proof course as you push the bolt in. A final example of how it can be difficult to communicate why building in Hempcrete is different is this brick cladding on the side of the building. The bricks are tied to the timber frame using stainless steel ties, and the timber frame is reinforced by the Hempcrete itself. Whilst it isn't self-supporting, Hempcrete does increase the racking strength of the timber frame that it's placed around, making the whole wall much stronger. This means that the brick cladding would be well supported by the Hempcrete wall itself, and this brick return here is not actually necessary. But as far as building control are concerned, this is standard practice for supporting a single skin brick wall. Adding that brick return caused quite a lot of extra complications, but once again, proving that it's not necessary is probably quite a complex calculation, so in this instance I had to let it go and get on with building it. That about concludes my building control chat. I hope that it's had you on the edge of your seat. It might be worth mentioning a little bit about party wall agreements. Party! I can honestly say they are the most fun you can have on your own. There's 2 neighbours affected by this structure and each of them needs a party wall agreement. Party! One allows me to put the flashing of the roof into the wall of the upstairs flat, and the other allows me to rebuild the party wall. Party! The actual detail of it is much the same kind of thing as submitting plans to building control. You've got to submit sections and elevations and all of that kind of jazz. The process requires 1 party wall surveyor. Party! And that party wall surveyor enacts the statute, which all party wall surveyors Party! Have got to enact, to make an agreement between the 2 neighbours. But if they're feeling nervous, the neighbours can appoint their own party wall surveyor. Party! And because I'm the one making the structure, I've got to pay for their party wall surveyor as well. Party! Now, because there's 2 different neighbours affected by the structure, that means 2 different party wall surveyors Party! That a neighbour may or may not decide to hire. Now, if each of those surveyors costs about 700 quid, that's a margin of error of £1,400 on the whole process, depending on whether or not the neighbours get anxious, which is quite stressful. As it turned out, one of them did appoint their own surveyor and one of them didn't, so I ended up paying for 2, my own and my neighbours', but not my other neighbours'. At the end of the whole process, you get a party wall document Party! That details exactly how it will be done and what window of time it needs to be done in, and when the agreement will expire, and then you can get on with building the party wall.
Party!
And that's about it. Ciao.